The rifle felt heavier than it had before. I paused, running the cloth carefully along the barrel once more, my fingers tracing the familiar grain of the worn wood of the stock. 5 years had not diminished the shine of the metal, nor had it erased the pain lingering in her chest. She had kept Jedediah's Winchester .73 in pristine condition, as if preserving the weapon might somehow keep a fragment of him alive, too. Outside, the northern wind whistled through the plains, a mournful sound echoing my inner emptiness. Dust motes floated in the beams of late afternoon light filtering through the cabin's small windows. They were the sole entities moving freely within this silent tomb of a home. Evelyn set the rifle across her lap and reached for the paper and pencil she had placed on the table. The date at the top seemed to mock her. April 17th, 1878. It was 5 years to the day since gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright, her husband, had died, and the fever had claimed their unborn child. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, "My dearest Jedediah, I am coming to you today. I've tried to carry on in this world without you, but it's only a half-life, a shadow of what once was. The land offers nothing but dust and memories. I tire of waking to silence and speaking to ghosts. Forgive me for what I am about to do for you, or perhaps thank me, because soon we will be together again, you and I, and the child we never met. Until then, your Evelyn." She folded the letter with care, placing it beside the photograph of Jedediah in his Union Army uniform. His deep blue, kind eyes, even in the stern pose demanded by the photographer, seemed to observe her as she picked up the rifle again. I checked that it was loaded, knowing well that it was. She had loaded it that morning with hands once steady enough to stitch wounds beneath cannon fire. She pressed the cold metal beneath her chin and closed her eyes. The sharp knock at the door startled me so powerfully that I nearly pulled the trigger unintentionally. "Mrs. Harper? Are you in there? It's Sheriff Caldwell." I lowered the rifle with a shuddering breath and swiftly slid it under the table. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, straightened her simple black dress, and then opened the door. The sheriff stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking tense, as he always did when visiting her homestead. He was a tall man with a heavy mustache and gentle eyes that reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter," he said, nodding respectfully. "Sheriff?" she replied, her voice rough from disuse. How long had it been since she'd spoken aloud to anyone? Weeks, perhaps. "I thought you should know there's an auction in town today. Foster's Mill Properties," he said hesitantly. "And why would that interest me?" she asked, her tone flat and disinterested. The blacksmith appeared even more uncomfortable. "Well, I know I sometimes attend these events," he trailed off, unable or unwilling to explain why he thought I had a habit of going. He wasn't wrong. I often watched auctions and foreclosures, not to buy, but to witness others' losses, as if observing their dismantling might somehow validate my own pain. It was a bitter form of communion with grief that I couldn't explain to anyone, least of all this otherwise kind but simple lawman. Sheriff James Caldwell continued, "Foster owed a lot of people, and everything's going under the hammer. His possessions, even his workers." Evelyn's attention sharpened at the mention of the workers. 3 women, sisters, indebted to him. Hayes looked down at his boots. "They're all in a family way." The words hit her like stones in still water. 3 pregnant women being sold like livestock. For a moment I felt a sharp, almost burning feeling pierce my protective numbness, cultivated over 5 years, a flash of anger or purpose. "The auction begins in an hour," James said, adjusting his hat. "Just thought you might want to know." After he departed, Evelyn stood motionless at the doorway, the suicide note on the table behind her momentarily forgotten. She turned her gaze to the rifle, then to gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright's photograph. My eyes looked different now, more than just watching. They seemed to be waiting. The auction was held in the dusty yard behind what had once been the Blackthorn Mill. A crowd of men gathered in the relentless sun, their faces damp with sweat, their expressions ranging from boredom to greed. The auctioneer, a thin man with yellowed teeth, stood on a makeshift platform, calling out items and taking bids in a grating voice. I stayed at the back, a dark silhouette against the weathered fence. No one approached her or acknowledged her presence. The widow Harper was a ghost among the living, an oddity best left alone. The old mill equipment was auctioned first, then the merchant's wagon and horses. Each item marked another piece of a life being dismantled. Evelyn watched with an emotionless detachment until the auctioneer announced the next lot. "Now, gentlemen, Foster's final assets." 3 women were led onto the platform, standing close together with their hands loosely bound by coarse rope. The eldest, likely in her mid-20s, held her chin high despite her obvious fear. The middle sister avoided eye contact, shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself smaller. The youngest, no more than 19, held her swollen belly protectively, her delicate features tight with terror. The Foster women, the auctioneer called them, as Lila, Amelia, and Clara, all 3 carrying, as you can see. He gestured dismissively at her. Evelyn Harper nodded toward the pantry and instructed, "Make breakfast. Then we'll see what you're capable of doing." She stepped outside to feed the few chickens she raised and to check on her horse, leaving the sisters to handle the morning meal preparations. When I came back inside, I discovered the table already set, with a pot of porridge simmering on the hearth. I was kneading dough for bread. My motions practiced, yet somewhat inefficient. They ate in the same silence as the night before, but this time I paid closer attention to the sisters. Lila, the eldest, had an air of quiet authority, standing tall with a straight back despite her pregnancy, her hands strong and her eyes watchful. Lila, the middle sister, was more delicate in build, her movements hesitant, her gaze often cast downward. Amelia noticed a fading bruise on Lila's cheek that matched the one on her sister-in-law's wrist. I am the youngest, and I tend to have a softer demeanor, but Evelyn often notices how I examine the herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, with sharp interest. After their meal, Evelyn assigned each sister a task. Lila was to help repair the chicken coop, Amelia was to wash the accumulated laundry, and Clara was to weed the struggling vegetable garden. "Can you use tools?" Evelyn asked Lila as they headed toward the chicken coop. "Yes, ma'am," I answered. "Our father was a carpenter before," I added softly. "Before what?" Evelyn wondered. "Before what?" I hesitated. "Before the war changed everything, I handed her a hammer. The west wall needed reinforcement. The coyotes nearly got in last month." We worked side by side in silence, the steady rhythm of our hammers filling the morning air. Sarah demonstrated skill with tools, her movements assured and practiced. From time to time, Evelyn saw her wince and place her hand on her swollen belly, but never heard her complain. "How far along are you?" Evelyn finally asked. 7 months, I think, I answered. "Amelia is about 6, Clara 5. Evelyn nodded, choosing not to ask the obvious questions about the fathers. Her silence was her way of respecting that boundary. "You should rest when you need to," she said matter-of-factly. "I need workers, not martyrs." I cast a questioning glance. Why did you buy us, Mrs. Winters? Really? Evelyn drove another nail into the wood with more force than necessary. I told you I need help with the farm. You outbid Colonel Langston? I pressed. That sounded like more than just needing farm hands. Evelyn put down her hammer and turned fully toward me. I understand what men like Colonel Richard Langston do to women like you, she stated plainly. I was a nurse during the war. I've seen what happens to vulnerable people when predators wield their power. My sister-in-law's blue eyes, so familiar yet unsettlingly intense, widened slightly. You were a nurse in the Union Army? Lila asked. Yes, that's how I met my husband. Evelyn picked up her hammer again, signaling the end of the conversation. The coop wouldn't fix itself. They resumed work, but Evelyn could feel Lila's gaze intermittently studying her, assessing her. It made her uncomfortable, as if the younger woman could see past the barriers I had so carefully built around my heart. By noon, the homestead had settled into a different rhythm. Amelia had hung laundry on the line, the first clothes to dance in the Nebraska wind in years. Clara had cleared half the garden of weeds and was examining the struggling plants closely. Quiet conversations and instructions punctuated the silence that had long defined the place. I stepped into the barn to check my supplies, needing a moment away from my shifting home. The familiar smell of hay and leather surrounded her as she counted sacks of grain and inspected her tools. This was her routine, her sense of control, an ordered life she'd crafted from the chaos of her grief. Mrs. Harper adjusted her hat and took a deep breath, feeling the calm settle over her once more. Winters? Amelia hesitantly appeared in the barn doorway, clutching a basket of folded laundry. Where should I put these? She asked softly. On the shelf by the hearth, Margaret replied. Amelia hesitated, gathering courage to speak further. I wanted to thank you, I finally said, for taking us in and not separating us. Margaret nodded, slightly uncomfortable with such gratitude. You're welcome. I began to mention Colonel Richard Langston, but stopped myself, my face paling. What about him? Margaret prompted. I shook my head. Nothing. I should finish the laundry. I turned to leave. Margaret called after me. Amelia, what do you know about Colonel Langston? I turned back slowly. He owns several businesses in town, bad places. Before Mr. Carter bought my contract, I worked in one of them. Her voice was almost a whisper. Places where women don't last long. Margaret felt a cold anger settle deep inside her chest. I see. She gestured toward Amelia's bruised cheek. Did Foster do that to you? Amelia's hand went to her face automatically. No, Mr. Foster wasn't kind, but he wasn't cruel either. This was from before. Margaret nodded in understanding. Go put away the laundry, then rest. You're carrying a child, and shouldn't overexert yourself. After Amelia left, Margaret stayed in the barn, processing the new information. If Amelia had worked in one of Colonel Richard Langston's establishments, it explained her fear when he bid on them and confirmed her instinct that intervening was the right choice. She hadn't saved them purely out of compassion. At least that's what she convinced herself. Her actions had been driven by instinct, part nurse's training, part a strange pull she felt when she saw Sarah's eyes. It wasn't kindness. It was something else, something I wasn't ready to name. Clara stepped out of the barn to find her sister-in-law kneeling in the garden, examining a plant with intense focus. The youngest sister had removed her bonnet, and her dark hair fell forward, hiding her face. What are you doing? Margaret asked. Clara looked up, startled. Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Winters. I was just looking at your herbs, she said, pointing to a scraggly plant. This yarrow is medicinal. My grandmother taught me it can stop bleeding and fight infection. I moved closer, intrigued despite myself. You know herbs? I nodded, a flicker of enthusiasm crossing my face. My grandmother was a healer. She taught me what plants can heal and which ones can harm. I gestured toward the garden. You have some good medicinal herbs here, but they need care. Show me, Margaret said, surprising herself as much as Clara. For the next hour, Clara led her through the garden, pointing out various plants and their uses. Her knowledge was impressive, and her quiet confidence grew as I listened to her talk about her grandmother's teachings. Feverfew for headaches, comfrey for broken bones, echinacea for fighting illness, Clara explained. Grandmother used to say, knowing plants is knowing life's secrets. Margaret found herself recalling her medical training, the frantic battlefield hospitals where herbal remedies often supplemented limited medicines. Your grandmother was right, I said. During the war, herbs sometimes saved more lives than doctors. Clara smiled for the first time since arriving, revealing dimples in her cheeks. You really were a nurse, I added. You mentioned it, I replied. I was for 3 years. That's why you have the medical books, nodding toward the cabin. Margaret frowned. What medical books? She asked. On the high shelf behind the flour barrel. I saw them when we made breakfast, I answered. My smile faded, worry replacing it. I'm sorry I wasn't snooping, I added. It's all right, Margaret interrupted. You have good eyes. She had kept her medical texts, although she rarely looked at them anymore. They were relics of another life, just like Gunslinger, Jedediah Cartwright's rifle and journal. By late afternoon, the homestead had undergone a noticeable transformation through quiet but steady work. The chicken coop had been repaired, laundry was hanging on the line, and the vegetable patch was half weeded and assessed. Inside the cabin, everything had been swept, dusted, and the hearth cleaned, with bread rising near the fire. I stood on the porch, observing the setting sun paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The day's efforts had yielded more results than most recent days, and the sisters had proved themselves capable and diligent despite their circumstances. For the first time in 5 years, Margaret had spent a day with her mind occupied by anything beyond her grief. A movement at the edge of her land drew her gaze. A rider approached slowly, his figure silhouetted against the sunset. As I drew nearer, I recognized Sheriff James Caldwell. I tensed, wondering what reason had brought him so soon after the auction to my homestead. The sisters retreated inside at the sight of the approaching rider, their instinctual weariness serving as another reminder of their past treatment. The man dismounted and removed his hat as he moved closer to the porch. "Good evening, ma'am." "Harper," he said, his expression troubled. "Sheriff," she replied. "What brings you out here today?" Caldwell looked toward the cabin, where the shadows of the sisters could be seen through the window. "I just wanted to make sure everything's all right with your new acquisitions." "We're managing," Margaret answered. "Is that all?" Caldwell shifted uneasily. "Town gossip is about you buying those women and about you crossing Colonel Langston," he said quietly. "People really should mind their own affairs," Caldwell said, lowering his voice. He was asking questions about my land today. Margaret's focus sharpened. "What kind of questions? About my deed? About whether I'm up to date on property taxes?" Caldwell looked genuinely concerned. He seemed particularly interested in the southern section near the creek. "My papers are in order," Margaret asserted. "Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright made sure of that before he died." Caldwell nodded. I believe you, but Langston has a way of complicating matters, especially for women on their own or women in difficult circumstances. I can handle Langston, Margaret said, though a faint unease stirred within her. I studied her face for a moment. You know, you remind me of someone, I said unexpectedly. Can't quite place who, but there's something familiar about you. Margaret stiffened. Anything else, ma'am? I replaced my hat. Just be cautious, Mrs. Harper. Langston doesn't forget a slight, and he has reasons beyond today's auction to dislike you. What do you mean? Caldwell mounted his horse and answered as he rode away. Your husband, gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright, he testified against Langston during the war, didn't he? About mistreatment of prisoners. Margaret's surprise must have shown on her face, because Caldwell nodded grimly. Small world, Mrs. Carter. Word travels even years later, even out here. As he disappeared into the distance, I stayed on the porch, processing this new complication. If Caldwell knew about Jedediah's testimony against Langston, then Langston certainly remembered it. My bid at the auction hadn't just been a current insult. It had reopened old wounds. I turned back into the cabin and found the three sisters gathered near the hearth, their faces tense. Was that trouble? Lila asked directly. Not yet, I replied, but it may be coming. I moved to the pantry, pulling down the medical texts Clara had noticed earlier. She had not opened them in years, but now my fingers brushed over the worn leather bindings, stirring a memory of purpose, of skill, of a time when I had been more than a vessel of grief. Lila, I said suddenly, making a firm decision. Tomorrow, I'm going to teach you how to shoot. That night, long after the sisters had fallen asleep behind their curtain, Margaret sat at the table with a single candle burning. She opened gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright's journal to an entry she had read countless times before. April 3rd, 1863. Witnessed something today that will haunt me. Colonel Langston's regiment captured a dozen Union soldiers last week. Today I saw what remained of them. Not men anymore, just broken figures in blue uniforms. The court-martial proceedings start tomorrow. I will testify to what I saw, though Langston's reputation makes this dangerous. Some wrongs must be confronted, even at great cost. I keep thinking of Margaret safe at the field hospital. What would she say if she knew what I was about to do? She would tell me to speak truth, regardless of any consequence. Her moral compass is more true than mine. It's one of the many reasons I love her. Margaret closed the journal and looked toward the curtained corner where the sisters slept. Today she had acted without fully understanding her motivations, driven by an instinct she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps it was Lila's hauntingly familiar eyes. Perhaps it was the memory of who she had been during the war. Not just my sister-in-law, but Nurse Montgomery, a woman fighting death with every skill she possessed. Or perhaps it was simply that, faced with the choice between ongoing emptiness and dangerous purpose, some part of her had chosen life. She opened one of the medical texts and began to refamiliarize herself with the long-dormant knowledge. If trouble was approaching, she would be ready, not only for herself, but for the 3 lives, now 6, under her protection. The suicide note still lay hidden beneath the book. Margaret retrieved the letter, read it once more, then held it to the candle's flame. She watched as the paper blackened and curled, and her words of surrender turned to ash. Outside, the Nebraska wind continued its lonely song across the plains, but inside the cabin, for the first time in 5 years, Mary Johnson was planning for tomorrow. The Winchester pressed against my shoulder with familiar force as I handed the rifle to my sister-in-law. The tin can on the fence post, 50 yards away, danced and clattered to the ground. Once more, Margaret instructed, handing me the rifle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the east field as Lila Montgomery positioned the weapon against her shoulder, trying to mimic Margaret's stance. Her pregnancy made the posture awkward, but her hands remained steady as she held the gun. "Remember to breathe out as you squeeze the trigger," Margaret said. "Don't pull, just squeeze." Sarah nodded, narrowing her blue eyes in concentration. She took aim, exhaled slowly, and fired. The can on the next post wobbled but stayed standing. "Almost," I said. "You're anticipating the recoil. Try again." 3 weeks had gone by since the auction. Spring had fully taken hold of the Nebraska plains, painting the landscape with tentative green strokes. The homestead had undergone a similar change. Laundry fluttered on the line, the garden showed neat rows of young shoots, and the yard was dotted with chicken scratch marks. Each morning before work, Lila Montgomery continued to teach me to shoot. Amelia appeared from the cabin carrying a basket of mended clothing. She sat on the porch, her eyes flicking between Lila and the lesson, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Of the 3 sisters, she was the most timid, flinching at loud noises and keeping her gaze down when Margaret asked her questions. Lila fired again. This time the can flew from the post. "Better," Margaret nodded. 5 more rounds, then we start the day's chores." While Sarah reloaded, Margaret looked toward the cabin. Abigail was tending her recently expanded herb garden, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who knew her plants well. Since their arrival, my youngest sister had proven herself not only knowledgeable about herbs, but also gifted in their care. Plants that had withered for years now thrived under her touch. But she pressed on. "Last year there was talk about gold being discovered in a creek south of town. Colonel Richard Langston showed a keen interest. He sent men to pinpoint the exact location." Margaret sank heavily into a chair at the table. "Gold in my creek. I'm not sure if it's your creek specifically," Amelia said, "but it would explain why he's after the land." The implications settled over the room like a gathering storm outside. "If there's supposed gold in my creek, Colonel Richard Langston would stop at nothing to acquire it. We need to find out for sure," Margaret finally declared. "Tomorrow, once the storm has passed, we'll check the creek ourselves." The rest of the evening settled into tense silence. The storm raged outside, rain pounding against the windows and thunder shaking the small cabin. I kept checking that my rifle was loaded, and within reach, flinching at every sound that might signal approaching riders through the downpour. My sister and I huddled near the hearth, whispering quietly among ourselves. Occasionally, I caught snippets of their concerns, about Colonel Richard Langston, about our futures, about the babies we carried. As night deepened and the storm began to die down, I made a decision. "I need to know more about all of you," she said suddenly, turning from the window to face the sisters. "If we're to face Colonel Richard Langston together, I need to understand what we're up against." The sisters looked at each other. Lila, as usual, took the lead. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Margaret replied. "How I ended up in foster care, what I know about Colonel Richard Langston, who fathered my children." She paused. "And why my eyes look so much like my husband's." Sarah's hand instinctively went to her throat, where a small locket hung on a delicate chain. A detail Margaret had noticed before, but hadn't commented on. Now Sarah spoke hesitantly. "We have all night," she said. "And I think it's time for honesty between us." Sarah took a deep breath. "Our father was the son of Jonathan Miser," she said quietly. He was a carpenter in Ohio before the war. The name struck Margaret hard, Jonathan Winters, Thomas's father. That's impossible, she whispered. Thomas never mentioned having sisters. Half-sisters, Lila clarified. Different mothers. Our mother was Jonathan's second wife, after Jedediah's mother died. Gunslinger? Jedediah Cartwright was already grown and gone by then, and he joined the army before I was born. I don't think he even knew about us. Margaret's mind raced, trying to grasp this revelation. Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright had rarely spoken of his family, only that they had died or scattered during the war. He'd been an only child, his mother dead of consumption. When he was young, his father remarried a woman he hardly knew. "How did you end up here?" she finally asked. "In Nebraska." Lila Montgomery's fingers traced the outline of the locket. "When our father died in the war, our mother tried to keep the family together, but it was hard. She fell ill. Before she died, she gave me this locket with her husband's picture inside." She opened it, revealing a small, faded photograph of a man with startling blue eyes, just like Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright's. "She made me promise to keep our family united. After she passed, we had nowhere to go." Amelia softly added, "We moved west, looking for work." She trailed off then, looking down. "Amelia ended up working for Colonel Richard Langston. I was working as a seamstress in town. Abigail was too young to work, so she stayed with me. When I learned what kind of place Ruth was in, I tried to get her out, but Blackwood wouldn't release her indenture. Then Mr. Foster offered to buy all 3 of our contracts," Abigail added. "He needed help at the mill and around his house. He wasn't exactly kind, but he was fair. Better than Colonel Richard Langston." "And the fathers of your children?" Margaret asked. The sisters went silent. Amelia was the first to answer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am one of Colonel Richard Langston's men. I didn't have a choice." Clara reached for her sister's hand. "Mine is a boy from town. We were sweet on each other, but when he learned about the baby, he left." Lila Montgomery straightened her shoulders. "Mine was my intended, but he died of fever before we could marry." Margaret absorbed this, her world tipping on its axis. These women, these girls, really, were Jedediah's family, his half-sisters, making us, "We're family," she whispered, feeling the weight of the word. "Jedediah was my half-brother." "I'm your sister-in-law," she said softly. "When I saw you at the auction, I recognized you from the description Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright wrote in his letters to his father. He spoke of his nurse wife with healing hands and a fierce heart. I knew it was you, but I wasn't sure you'd want to acknowledge us." "You knew who I was at the auction?" Margaret asked, stunned. "Yes," she admitted. "I was hoping you'd see the resemblance and help us. But I never expected you'd buy our contracts." "I didn't know," Margaret said faintly. "I didn't recognize the connection. I only knew that your eyes—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the implications. "Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright never knew about you. Cartwright. If he had, he would have searched for you," she said. "We tried to find him after the war," Clara added. "But we had no address, no way to locate him. Then we heard from a returning soldier that Lieutenant Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright had settled in Nebraska with his wife. We were trying to save enough to come here, but everything fell apart," Amelia finished softly. Margaret rose and walked to the shelf where she kept Thomas's few belongings. She took down a wooden box and returned to the table. From it, she pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These are from Gunslinger. Jedediah Cartwright to me during the war, she said. One mentions his father's remarriage, but he never spoke of siblings. She sifted through the letters until she found the one she sought. Here, she read aloud, "Father has remarried a younger woman named Grace. I have not met her, being occupied with this war, but I hope she brings him happiness in his final years. Sometimes I regret our arrangement, but I believe I'm doing right by the path I've chosen, even if he cannot see it." Margaret looked up at the sisters. His and his father's opinions about the war differed. Lila nodded. Father wasn't political, but he feared losing his only son. After Jedediah left, though, Father changed. He supported the Union cause quietly, and that's how he met our mother. She was organizing supplies for Union soldiers. The revelations pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. All these years, I had believed myself alone, my only family connection severed with Jedediah's death. Now, unexpectedly, she had 3 sisters-in-law and soon 3 nieces or nephews. "Does Colonel Richard Langston know about this?" I asked sharply. The sisters glanced at each other again. "I don't think so," Lila said. "We never spoke of our family in town." It wasn't safe to advertise Union ties in some places, even after the war. I nodded, deep in thought. Good. Let's keep it that way for now. I eyed each sister. This changes things, but it also makes us more vulnerable. If Blackwood learns you're connected to Thomas, it will only make him more determined against us. "What do we do now?" Abigail asked, her hand unconsciously resting on her swollen belly. Margaret's jaw clenched. "First, we confirm whether there's gold in that creek. Then we secure our legal rights and prepare for what's ahead." She stood, more determined than she had been in years. These weren't just 3 women she'd saved on impulse. They were family. Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright's blood. Protecting them was more than defiance against Blackwood. Tomorrow will be a long day ahead. The morning after the storm broke, the sky was clear and bright, with the Nebraska clouds blown away. I got up early, my sleep disrupted, and filled with dreams of Jedediah and his unknown sisters. I discovered Lila already awake, sitting at the table with Jedediah's diary open in front of her. "I hope you don't mind," Lila said, glancing up as Margaret approached. "I wanted to learn more about my brother." Margaret should have felt a protective intrusion into Jedediah's private thoughts, but instead she experienced a strange relief that someone else now carried a fragment of his memory. "He would have loved knowing you," she said softly. After a simple meal, the 4 women headed toward the creek. The recent rain had swollen the water beyond its banks, flowing swiftly and muddily over rocks and fallen branches. "We need to find the spots where the water moves slowest," Margaret explained, guiding them downstream. "If there's gold, it would settle in the bends where the current weakens." They spent the morning examining the creek, looking for the faint gleam of gold among the stones and silt. The work was wet and muddy, our skirts quickly soaked and stained. I demonstrated how to pan for gold using a small tin dish from the kitchen, scooping up sediment from the creek bed, and swirling it carefully to separate the heavier metals. By noon, we had found only ordinary pebbles and dirt. Margaret began to suspect Amelia had misunderstood or misheard the story she reported. "Let's try farther downstream," she suggested, wiping sweat from her forehead. The spring sun was surprisingly warm, and all 4 women had taken off their bonnets and rolled up their sleeves. They moved to where the creek sharply curved, leaving Emily's property behind. Here the water deepened, forming a small, still eddy on the inside of the bend. Clara, who had been quietly watching all morning, suddenly spoke up. Mrs. Winters, look at those plants here. Margaret turned toward where the youngest sister was pointing. Along the bank grew a type of rush I hadn't noticed before, with pointed tips. What about them? She asked. My grandmother called them gold pointers, Clara explained. They often grow where there are mineral deposits. The roots thrive in the same conditions as gold. Clara, my sister-in-law, inspected the plants with a new curiosity. Show me where they're most dense, I said. Clara led me to a spot where the rushes grew thick. I kneeled and started digging into the bank with my hands, scooping mud and roots aside to reach the soil underneath. Lila helped as well, using a stick to dig deeper. After a few minutes of trying, her stick hit something hard. Rocks, she said disappointedly. Let me see, Margaret insisted, reaching into the hole. She pulled out a stone about the size of her palm, covered in mud. She rinsed it in the creek, washing away the dirt. As the water cleared, we all gasped. Embedded in the gray stone were visible veins of yellow, small but unmistakable. Gold, Amelia whispered, her eyes wide. Margaret examined the stone from all angles. Not much in this piece, but if there's some, there could be more nearby. She looked at the sisters with a serious expression. This is why Colonel Richard Langston wants our land. Lila's face hardened with resolve. What now? Margaret tucked the rock into her pocket and brushed mud from her skirt. Now we know what's at stake, and I'll ensure our claim is solid. During the return trip to the cabin, my mind was flooded with plans and estimates. The amount of gold wasn't massive, not enough for headlines, but even a modest deposit could have value. More than that, it explained Colonel Richard Langston's sudden interest in land he had ignored for years. I need to go to town, I announced when we reached the homestead, to check our deed and speak with Sheriff Caldwell. I'll come with you, Amelia immediately offered. Margaret shook her head. No, you should stay here with Clara and the others. Keep the rifle close and stay vigilant. But we can't leave them unprotected, Margaret insisted. And you're the only one who can handle the rifle, if necessary. Sarah reluctantly nodded. I changed into my best dress, a navy blue gown I hadn't worn since Jedediah's funeral, then hitched my horse to the small wagon. Before leaving, I placed the gold-rich stone in a leather pouch and tucked it safely in my pocket. I'll be back before dark, she promised. If anyone arrives, fire a warning shot. They'll probably turn away. If they don't, look at Sarah and hold your ground. Do what you must that changes things significantly. If gold has been confirmed on my property, Colonel Richard Langston will stop at nothing to seize it. Therefore, I must proceed with filing a mineral claim. Margaret decided that strengthening her legal position was essential. The claims office is located at the courthouse, Sheriff Caldwell informed her. However, Mrs. Wires, I must warn you that filing an official claim will only reinforce what Colonel Langston already suspects. It could even speed up his plans. It's better to secure my legal rights than cross my fingers and hope he abandons his pursuit, Margaret responded determinedly. Will you accompany me to submit the claim? James hesitated briefly before nodding. I'll assist you, but there's something I need to tell you beforehand. He looked around the bustling street. Not here. Let's speak privately in my office. Once inside the sheriff's office, James Caldwell appeared unusually uneasy. I paced behind my desk, removing my hat and running a hand through my hair. Elizabeth, I began, using her first name for the first time. What I'm about to tell you might come as a shock. I felt a wave of tension grip me as I braced myself for unsettling news about Colonel Richard Langston or the legal status of my land. My full name is James Caldwell Winters, he said softly. I'm Jedediah Cartwright's half-brother. I stared at him, confusion evident on my face. That can't be true. Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright was an only child, after all. Hazer Winters shook his head. Half-brother, born from different mothers. My mother was Jonathan Winters' sister-in-law, his first wife's sibling. After Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright's mother died, Jonathan married again quickly to cover up the scandal, and I was born just 7 months after that marriage. Margaret felt her body sink into the chair she had previously refused, her mind reeling from losing yet another family connection in less than a day. Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright never mentioned you, she murmured faintly. He didn't learn about me until we met during the war. I was assigned to his unit as a private. Sheriff James Caldwell gave a mournful smile. Our resemblance was noticed by others before we realized the connection ourselves. Why didn't he tell me? Margaret asked, a sting of betrayal in her voice, realizing Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright had kept such a secret. He intended to tell you after the war, Sheriff Caldwell assured her. He wrote to me often about you, saying you were the best person he had ever known, and that you would understand and accept me, his family. But then, he died, she finished softly. I nodded. I was stationed in Missouri when I received the message. By the time I could come back, he was already gone. I didn't know how to approach you in your grief, claiming to be family I'd never heard of. So you became sheriff here, observing me from afar, Margaret thought. Sheriff James Caldwell continued. I promised Jedediah I'd look out for you if anything happened to him. She studied his face anew, noticing faint traces of Jedediah, the shape of his brow, the set of his jaw, hidden beneath the surface. Why are you telling me now? She questioned. Because you're in danger, Hayes said gravely. Real danger. And I've seen a change in you these past few weeks. Since those women arrived at your farm, you've come alive again? Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright would be happy about that. Margaret inhaled deeply, trying to process all this new information. Those women, the sisters I purchased at auction, are also part of Jedediah's family, his half-sisters from his father's second marriage. Sheriff Caldwell's eyes widened in genuine surprise. That can't be a coincidence. No one could know. Margaret nodded. It appears Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright had more family than either of us realized. Standing firm, she added, that only enhances my resolve to protect what's ours. What are you planning to do? Sheriff James Caldwell asked. First, I'll file that mineral claim, Margaret said assuredly, and then I'll prepare for whatever Blackwood has in store. She looked Hayes directly in the eyes. Will you help us as part of our family? Sheriff James Caldwell straightened his posture, his expression solemn. I've been helping from the shadows for 5 years, Margaret. It's time I did so openly. Together, we headed toward the courthouse to officially file Margaret's claim on the gold from her creek. As she signed the papers, Margaret sensed a strange feeling. Things were coming full circle. 5 years earlier, I had been barely alive, consumed by grief over a man I loved. Now, I was fighting for a future, not just for myself, but for the family Thomas never knew he had. As they left the courthouse, Margaret spotted a familiar figure across the street. Colonel Richard Langston stood outside his bank, deep in conversation with 2 surveyors who had recently visited her property. His gaze lifted at her glance, and his eyes narrowed when he recognized her with James Caldwell. Margaret met his stare without flinching, refusing to show fear. After a moment, Richard broke contact and turned back to his conversation with a dismissive gesture. "He's aware we're making moves," Sheriff James Caldwell murmured. "Good," Margaret responded. "Let him see we're not helpless women who can be intimidated." As they returned to her wagon, Margaret felt the weight of the heavy gold-bearing stone in her pocket, symbolizing both danger and opportunity. A threat to her family's safety, but also a chance to forge a new beginning. "Come out to the farm tonight," she told the sheriff. "Meet your nieces properly. We need to plan ahead." I nodded, a serious but determined look on my face. "I'll be there after sundown." I climbed into my wagon, already thinking ahead to the confrontation I knew was coming. Colonel Richard Langston would soon take action, now that his claim was filed, but he would discover that the widow Winters and her newly discovered family were not as easy to intimidate as he believed. This time, I had something worth fighting for. Not just land or gold, but the future gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright would have wanted for all of us. As I drove my wagon out of town, I caught a final glimpse of Colonel Richard Langston watching my departure. She straightened her back and lifted her chin, drawing on the strength I had once shown on blood-soaked battlefields. The war might have ended years ago, but for me, a new battle was just beginning. Twilight spread over the plains like a prayer, painting the endless sky with strokes of indigo and gold. I stood on my porch, watching the horizon where the sun had just set. In the distance, a lone rider approached, outlined against the fading light. Sheriff James Caldwell was behind her. The cabin hummed quietly with activity. Lila Montgomery moved around the table, setting out plates for supper. Amelia stirred a pot of stew that filled the air with savory aromas. Clara arranged freshly picked wildflowers in a jar, a simple touch of beauty that would have once seemed trivial to Margaret. It was remarkable how quickly my life had changed, how solitude had been replaced by family in such a short time. For 5 years I had lived in suspension, a shell of grief preserving my memories. Now, suddenly, the homestead was alive once more, but that life was fragile. "He's coming!" Margaret called out, not taking her eyes off the approaching rider. Lila joined me on the porch, her brother's rifle held comfortably in her arms. Her pregnancy was now quite pronounced, making the weapon look somewhat out of place against her rounded belly. Still, she held it with the confidence of someone who had practiced often. "Just one rider?" she asked, tense. "It's James Caldwell," I confirmed. "But stay alert. Colonel Richard Langston could have men watching." The sisters had taken the news about James Caldwell surprisingly well. Perhaps, after discovering they were gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright's half-sisters, learning about another hidden sibling didn't seem so shocking anymore. Or maybe they had simply grown used to dealing with unpredictable circumstances. I dismounted as I reached the yard, leading my horse the remaining distance. Even in the dimming light, Margaret could see the worry etched on my face. "Anything trouble on the road?" she inquired as I approached. I shook my head. "None that I could see, but that doesn't mean we're not under observation," Sheriff James Caldwell replied as he took off his hat and stepped onto the porch. "Good evening, Lila." I nodded quietly, analyzing his face with newfound awareness. "You have his eyes, too," she remarked. A faint smile drifted across Sheriff Caldwell's face. Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright always said our eyes revealed the connection. He then turned to Margaret. "May I come inside? There's much we need to discuss." Inside the cabin, Sheriff James Caldwell was properly introduced to Amelia Blake and Clara Mason. The younger sisters were more reserved than my sister-in-law, approaching this unexpected uncle with cautious curiosity. But as they sat down for supper, the initial awkwardness gradually faded. Sheriff James Caldwell shared stories of my husband with heartfelt sincerity, recounting moments from their time together during the war that Margaret had never known. He carried your picture everywhere, I told her. He showed it to anyone willing to look, saying you were the strongest person he'd ever known, that you could stitch a man up while shells exploded around you. I felt a sharp wave of memory. He exaggerated. I was just doing my duty. He didn't exaggerate about your bravery, Hayes said, and I believe you'll need it once more. His face grew serious. Blackwood is moving faster than I anticipated. After you left town today, the sheriff formally contested your property boundary. Margaret gripped her fork tighter. On what basis? He claims to have discovered an earlier survey that marks the creek as the boundary instead of the cottonwoods. Sheriff James Caldwell shook his head in frustration. It's a lie, of course, but Judge Whitaker has agreed to hear the case. When my sister-in-law, Lila Montgomery, asked sharply 2 weeks from now, Sheriff James Caldwell looked grim but said, I don't think Colonel Richard Langston intends to wait for the court to decide. The men he's brought along aren't the type to respect the law. How many? Margaret inquired. At least 6 I've seen. Tough men, all of them. The sisters exchanged worried glances. Ruth's face was pale, her hand instinctively rubbing her belly, as if to shield the child inside. What should we do? Clara asked, her young voice steady despite her fear. Margaret weighed their options. They could leave the homestead and escape to another territory where Colonel Richard Langston wouldn't reach them. But that would mean abandoning not only the land and gold, but everything gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright had built for his family, including the family he never knew he had. We stay, she declared firmly. Amelia Blake questioned softly. That's 7, counting Blackwood, Hayes corrected quietly. And 4 of us, Sarah added, straightening her shoulders. 5 with the sheriff. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. My role complicates things. As the sheriff, I swore an oath to uphold the law, even unjust laws. If Colonel Richard Langston wins that court case, we must stand our ground before the hearing. Margaret turned to Sheriff James Caldwell. How soon do you think they'll strike? Soon. Maybe within days. I leaned forward as Colonel Richard Langston's fury grew when he learned I had filed a mineral claim. He knew about the gold. The weight of our situation settled over us like a heavy cloak. 4 women, 3 of whom are pregnant, and 1 lawman face off against Colonel Richard Langston and his men. The odds weren't on our side, but I had faced terrible challenges before, on battlefields where the dead outnumbered the living, and my hands had been the only barrier between wounded soldiers and eternity. We must prepare, I said, my nursing instincts already assessing what we would need. Supplies, ammunition, medical essentials. I looked at each sister in turn. And we need to make this place defensible. Sheriff James Caldwell nodded in agreement. I can bring supplies tomorrow, extra weapons, more ammo. But Margaret, you should consider sending the sisters somewhere safe. No, Clara said immediately. We stay together. Amelia and Abigail nodded, though fear lingered in their eyes. We are family, Clara said simply. All of us. Margaret felt warmth spread inside her. Family. For so long, she had been alone, her only link to the world severed, when gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright died. Now, suddenly, she had people to protect, people willing to stand with her. Then we all stayed, she decided. But we'll be smart about it. Sheriff Caldwell, what else can you tell us about Colonel Richard Langston's men? As Sheriff James Caldwell described the hired guns, what they looked like, their weapons, their experience, Margaret began formulating a plan. By the time supper ended and the lamps dimmed, they had mapped out a strategy for defending the homestead. Lila would return with supplies the next day. She would reinforce the cabin and barn, creating defensive positions and escape routes if necessary. I would keep practicing with the rifle. Amelia and Clara prepared medical kits and food to last through a siege. "I should go," Sheriff James Caldwell finally said, rising from the table. "If I'm gone too long, it might raise suspicion." Margaret walked him to the door. Outside, the Nebraska night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds. "Be careful," Margaret warned. "Colonel Richard Langston might be watching me now, too, since he's seen us together." Sheriff James Caldwell adjusted his hat. "I can handle myself." He hesitated before softly adding, "Thomas would be proud of you, Margaret, of how you've protected his family." Margaret's throat tightened. "I didn't realize I was protecting his family when I bought the sisters. You just couldn't stand by and let innocent people suffer," Hayes finished for her. "That's who you are. That's always been who you are, even when grief clouded everything." After Sheriff James Caldwell left, Margaret went inside. By late morning, he arrived with a wagon filled with supplies, extra weapons, food staples, and medical gear. He also brought troubling news, none of it good. As they unloaded the wagon, he reported that Colonel Richard Langston's men had been drinking heavily last night at the saloon, discussing claiming gold and asserting dominance over women. I tried to warn them about respecting property rights, but they just laughed at me. "When will they come?" I asked, securing a box of ammunition inside the cabin. "Soon. Maybe today or tomorrow." Sheriff James Caldwell looked worried. "I can't stay, Margaret. If I'm gone when they move, Colonel Richard Langston will realize I warned you." I nodded in understanding. "We'll handle it. I'll try to delay them or create a distraction in town to buy you some time." Sheriff James Caldwell handed me a folded note. "This is a telegram I sent to the territorial governor about Colonel Richard Langston's threats and his suspicious claim. It might not help immediately, but it will create a record." "Thank you," I said, slipping the paper into my pocket. Before leaving, James spent an hour with Lila, teaching her more shooting techniques, how to lead a moving target, conserve ammunition, and shoot from cover. He also briefly advised Amelia and Clara, offering encouragement and practical tips for what might lie ahead. When he finally mounted his horse to depart, he looked back at me once more. "If things go badly, there's a cavalry outpost 40 miles east. They might respond if called about armed violence against civilians." I replied, "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." The rest of the day was dedicated to intense preparations. I drew on my war-honed skills to assess our resources, plan for casualties, and establish clear procedures for various scenarios. By nightfall, we were as prepared as possible. The cabin had been fortified with furniture arranged for cover, and buckets of water stood ready to fight fires. Weapons and ammunition had been strategically distributed across the homestead. As darkness settled, I gathered the sisters in the cabin. Outside, a spring storm was brewing, thunder rumbling in the distance, reminding me of distant artillery fire, sounds I hoped I would never associate with home. "Try to rest," I advised. "Sleep in shifts. Stay alert. 2 awake, 2 asleep." Amelia, who had been mostly silent all day, suddenly spoke up. "If they come, if Colonel Richard Langston comes," she hesitated, swallowing hard, "he won't show mercy." "Neither will we," Lila Montgomery said firmly, checking Thomas's rifle once more. I looked at each of them, Lila with her determined jaw and Jedediah's piercing blue eyes, Amelia with her fragile exterior masking unexpected strength, and Clara with her quiet wisdom beyond her years. In just a few weeks, they had become more than those I was protecting. They were family. Whatever happens, I said, we face it together. An hour later, the storm hit full force. Rain battered the windows, thunder shook the cabin's sturdy walls. I took the first watch with Lila Montgomery, while Amelia Blake and Clara Mason tried to sleep behind the curtains. We sat silently by the fire, listening to the storm's fury. I couldn't help but recall another night of thunder years ago, when Thomas and I had huddled in a field hospital under artillery fire. He had held my hand, their touch still an anchor in chaos. He would have loved you, I said to Lila suddenly, gazing into the flickering flames. Jedediah always wanted siblings. Lila smiled faintly. I used to imagine meeting him. In my mind, he was bigger than life, an officer fighting for justice. He was just a man, I whispered. A good man, but human. Afraid sometimes, uncertain. Still, I always tried to do what was right, even if it cost me. Like testifying against Colonel Richard Langston, Lila noted. I nodded. That was gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright. He couldn't stand cruelty or injustice, no matter the personal risk. We fell silent again, each lost in thoughts of the man who connected us. Outside, the storm's rage began to lessen. Thunder grew distant. Rain softened to a gentle patter. In that quiet moment, we heard it, the unmistakable sound of horses approaching. I was instantly on my feet. "Wake Ruth and Abigail," I ordered softly, reaching for my revolver. "Get them to the root cellar." Sarah quickly roused her sisters as I peered cautiously through a window. Through the dim moonlight, I saw several riders approaching from the south, from the direction of the creek. "How many?" Lila asked, returning with the rifle. "At least 4, maybe more," I replied. "They're trying to hide among the trees." Amelia and Clara appeared from behind the curtains, pale but composed. "Get to the root cellar," I instructed. "Bring water, bandages, and a weapon. Stay quiet no matter what." Amelia hesitated. "And you and Lila?" "We'll handle this," I said confidently, though I felt uncertain. "Go now, quickly." As my younger sister-in-law disappeared through the trap door beneath the cabin, I turned to her. "Remember what Hayes taught you. Don't fire unless you see a clean shot. Make every shot count." Sarah nodded grimly, taking a position at one window while I covered another. We dimmed the lamps, leaving only the feeble glow of the dying fire inside. Outside, the riders had stopped at the edge of the clearing. I counted 6 figures, occasionally lit by moonlight piercing the clouds, and saw them gesturing toward the cabin and barn. "Colonel Langston's not with them," Lila whispered. "He wouldn't risk being directly involved." "No," I replied. "These are his hired guns." One of the men broke away from the group, approaching the cabin cautiously. When he was about 30 yards away, he called out loudly, "Hello, house." "Anyone awake in there?" I and Lila Montgomery remained silent, watching. "We know you're inside, Mrs. Winters," the man continued. "Just want to talk about that creek property. Colonel Richard Langston sent us with a generous offer." Still, we didn't respond. The man shrugged and signaled to his companions, who then spread out, 2 heading toward the barn, the others moving toward the cabin. "They're surrounding us," Lila said tensely. I quickly decided. "Fire a warning shot over their heads." Sarah aimed carefully through the window and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed into the night, causing the men to dive for cover. "That's your warning. This land is mine. Leave now," I shouted. Silence followed, then mocking laughter from the darkness. "2 women against 6 men," someone called back. Bad odds, ladies. We're taking that Gold Creek one way or another. There are no papers that'll make me give up what's mine, I replied. Leave now or face the consequences. Margaret and I methodically returned fire, shifting between windows to create the illusion of greater numbers defending the homestead. They're trying to reach the porch, Sarah warned, shooting at a shadow darting amid the trees. Margaret saw another figure, dashing toward the barn. She fired twice, missing with the first shot, but hitting him with the second. The man staggered but kept advancing, vanishing into the shadowy interior of the barn, I recalled. Margaret predicted they would attempt to set the cabin on fire, reloading her revolver with practiced movements. We had to keep the attackers away from the walls. For what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, they maintained their defense, shooting only at clear targets to make every shot count, as Sheriff James Caldwell had advised. 2 of the assailants were definitely wounded. Margaret had heard their cries and watched as one was dragged to cover by his comrades. However, the others were adjusting their tactics, hiding behind outbuildings and trees as they pushed closer to the cabin, knowing our ammunition wouldn't last forever. A new sound drew her attention. A shattering of glass followed by the unmistakable whoosh of flames igniting. Through the window, she saw the side of the barn burst into flames. "They're burning us out," Sarah gasped, her face illuminated by the blazing fire. Margaret quickly assessed the situation. The barn's distance from the cabin meant the fire wouldn't spread immediately, but posed a new threat. I took one last walk around the homestead while Sheriff Harper and his deputies prepared the wagons. I felt myself pulled toward the creek, the source of both our danger and hope for prosperity. The water flowed smoothly over polished stones, hiding the gold that lay concealed along its banks. I knelt and dipped my hand into the current, watching as the water slipped through my fingers like fleeting time. "Mrs. Harper, I just wanted to say thank you," the young woman said, her voice steadier than when she first arrived at the homestead. "Not just for helping us at the auction, but for teaching us to be resilient." I looked at her in surprise. "I didn't teach you that. You were already strong. You just had to remember it." Amelia shook her head. "Before coming here, I believed I was broken. What happened at Colonel Richard Langston's place? I thought it had destroyed something inside me that could never be fixed. I rested a hand on my swollen belly, but watching you learn from you helped me see that we can endure terrible things and still have a future." Tears unexpectedly prickled my eyes. "We all have a future now," I said softly. "Together." When we returned to the cabin, Sheriff Caldwell was helping Sarah and Abigail into the wagon. The wounded prisoners had already been placed into a second wagon under guard. "Are you ready?" Sheriff Caldwell asked as I approached. I cast one last glance at the homestead, at the life I had built with Jedediah, at the solitude I had maintained since his death, and at the unexpected family I had found in his absence. "Yes," I replied. "I'm ready." The trip to town went smoothly, although Colonel Langston kept his men alert for any signs of Blackwood. We arrived in Dover late in the afternoon, earning cautious glances from the townspeople as we made our way toward the jail. I arranged rooms for the women at the small hotel, believing it was safer than my modest quarters behind the sheriff's office. As we settled in, I thought about the last time I stayed in Dover, the night before my husband and I left for our homestead, full of hope for our future. Now I was back, a different woman with a different family, facing an uncertain tomorrow. The next day brought news that Colonel Richard Langston had been seen boarding the eastbound train, apparently fleeing the territory. I was skeptical. "It's too convenient," I said when I visited us at the hotel. "Blackwood isn't the type to surrender so easily." His suspicion proved right. That evening, while Lila and I discussed rebuilding the barn in our hotel room, a commotion broke out in the street below. Lila moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtain. "It's Colonel Richard Langston," she reported nervously, along with Judge Whitaker and several other men. "They're going into the sheriff's office." I joined her at the window, watching as the prominent figures disappeared into the building across the street. "He's making his move legally now." "What can he do?" Clara asked worriedly. "With Parker's help, I could issue warrants, make false claims, and twist the law to my advantage." My mind raced. We needed to get to Sheriff Caldwell. But before I could move, another sound rose from the street, a swift approach of hooves, many of them coming from the east. A squadron of cavalry riding in formation appeared, led by an officer whose stance suggested authority. "The cavalry," Ruth whispered. Sheriff Caldwell's telegram worked. We watched as the officer dismounted outside the sheriff's office, followed by several of his men. The rest of the troop remained mounted, their presence silencing the usual bustle of the street. I decided we should go downstairs and find out what was happening. We hurried to the hotel lobby just as Sheriff Turner burst through the front door, looking relieved but urgent. "Lila, thank God you're here. Come quickly, all of you." "What's going on?" I asked as we followed him outside. Sheriff Caldwell explained hurriedly. "He's responding to my telegram about armed violence against civilians and has brought additional documents regarding Colonel Richard Langston's war crimes." My heart pounded. Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright's testimony. Colonel Richard Langston nodded. Apparently it had been filed but not acted upon until now. Reynolds served under the same commander as Jedediah. When he saw Colonel Langston's name in my telegram, he connected the dots and brought the file. We entered the sheriff's office to find a tense standoff underway. Colonel Richard Langston, a stern man in his 40s, faced Judge Whitaker. Several cavalry soldiers flanked their captain, while Colonel Richard Langston's few remaining supporters looked nervously to one side. "Mrs. Harper," Captain Montgomery greeted us as we came in. "Your reputation precedes you. Your husband served honorably under Colonel Harris, as did I." "Thank you, Captain," I said, noticing Colonel Langston's glare. "I understand you've brought evidence about Colonel Blackwood." Montgomery pointed to a file on Sheriff Caldwell's desk. "Documentation of war crimes committed during the Civil War, torture and executions of Union prisoners in 1863. Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright was a key witness, though the case was set aside after the war." Judge Whitaker, a man with a thick beard, shifted uncomfortably. "That's interesting, Captain, but it doesn't affect this property dispute between Colonel Richard Langston and myself." "On the contrary," Colonel Richard Langston interjected. "It demonstrates a pattern of criminal behavior and motives rooted in revenge against her husband." Richard's composure finally cracked. "This is nonsense," he spat. Old history had been used as a distraction from the real issue: trespassing and mineral rights theft. "Theft," Margaret said firmly, stepping forward. "The creek runs through my land. The gold in it belongs to me by law." "Your property line is in dispute," Richard claimed. "A dispute you created," Sheriff Caldwell said firmly. "We have testimony from your hired men that you ordered them to seize the land by force, knowing your legal claim was fraudulent." I cleared my throat. "Judge Whitaker, I have orders to investigate reports of armed violence against civilians in this territory. Based on the evidence, including sworn statements from Sheriff Caldwell and these prisoners, Colonel Richard Langston seems to have organized an armed uprising. The judge looked increasingly pale as he listened. "That's a serious charge," he murmured. "Yes," Captain Montgomery agreed. "One that would normally be tried in a military court, given Colonel Langston's rank and the crimes." This was new to Judge Whittaker, and his loyalty to Colonel Langston visibly wavered. Colonel Richard Langston himself looked diminished, his commanding presence fading as he saw the tide turn. He glared at me with outright hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Yes, it is," I replied calmly. With a nod from Montgomery, 2 soldiers moved forward to arrest Colonel Richard Langston. The once formidable man offered no resistance, though his eyes flashed with threats until they led him away. Judge Whittaker, eager to distance himself from Colonel Richard Langston, assured Sheriff Caldwell and Captain Montgomery that he would dismiss any challenges to my property deed immediately. As the impromptu court adjourned, I found myself surrounded by my new family: Sarah, Ruth, Abigail on one side, Sheriff Caldwell on the other. We had all faced a man who once commanded fear and respect across the region. "It's really over," Clara said quietly as we stepped back into the street. Evelyn nodded softly, aware that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. The new barn would need to be rebuilt. The gold coursing through the creek would demand proper mining techniques. And before long, 3 new lives would arrive in the world. Thomas's nieces or nephews, children who would never meet him but would grow up hearing tales of his bravery. "What's the next step?" I asked quietly, unconsciously mirroring Evelyn's own thoughts. I looked at each of the women in turn. These women who had arrived as strangers and had become my family, and then at the man who had watched over me from afar, fulfilling a promise to his brother. Finally, she declared, "We head back home." Summer unfurled across the Kansas plains, splashing the once barren land in lush greens and shimmering golds. The new barn stood firm and weatherproof, its freshly cut timber still carrying the scent of pine in the warm breeze. Nearby, the chicken coop had doubled in size, now sheltering a flock that produced eggs enough to sell weekly in town. Evelyn sat on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl as the afternoon sun sank slowly toward the horizon. From inside the cabin, the sound of a baby's cry was quickly soothed by a gentle voice. Amelia Blake appeared at the doorway, holding a small bundle close. "He's settled now," she said softly, her face lit with the glow of new motherhood. "Just needed to be held." Evelyn smiled warmly. "Bring him here. Let him feel the breeze." I stepped onto the porch, carefully positioning my son, just 2 weeks old, so the fresh air could touch his tiny face. The baby's eyes, still the unfocused blue of newborns, blinked up at the vast Nebraska sky. "He looks more like you every day," Evelyn observed, pride shining in her voice. Amelia beamed. "Lila says he has the winter's eyes, like the family trait," she replied proudly. Inside, Lila's daughter, born just a month earlier, and the first of the 3 babies, peacefully slept in the cradle I had crafted for my own child, who never arrived. Abigail's labor was imminent. Her son or daughter would be the last addition to the trio of new lives transforming the homestead. The sound of a wagon approaching drew their attention. Hayes appeared around the bend, raising his hand in greeting. "Uncle James is here," Amelia told her son. Though the infant seemed unaware of the incoming visitor or her words, Sheriff James Caldwell had become a regular fixture at the homestead since Colonel Richard Langston's arrest and conviction. He had helped with the barn raising, gathering men from the town, and arranging for a mining expert to assess the creek's gold deposit, which proved modest but profitable enough to secure their future. Most importantly, he had become family, sharing stories of Jedediah, helping Lila improve her shooting, carving small wooden animals for the babies. "Ladies," Sheriff James Caldwell called as he stepped down from the wagon. "Such a fine afternoon." "Any news from town?" Evelyn asked as he joined them on the porch. Caldwell nodded. "Colonel Langston's appeal was denied. He'll serve his full sentence." I gently tickled the baby's cheek. "How is little Jedediah today?" Amelia, who had named her son after her half-brother she'd never met, replied with pride. "Getting stronger every day," I said, producing a letter from my pocket. "This is for you, Evelyn, from the governor's office." She set her bowl aside, accepting the envelope, which contained a formal document granting her additional land, an adjacent parcel, as compensation for damages during Colonel Richard Langston's attack. "More land," I mused, passing the letter to Amelia. Jedediah always wanted to expand. "Speaking of expansion," Sheriff James Caldwell said with a grin, "I've been thinking about that plot next to mine in town. It would be a perfect spot for a proper doctor's office." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "A doctor's office, or perhaps a nurse's practice," I amended. "Dover's growing, and folks need better medical care than what old Dr. Caldwell can provide. Sheriff James Caldwell can offer with his shaky hands and outdated methods." It wasn't the first time he had suggested that Evelyn reconsider her medical work. After the babies started arriving, I found myself using my dormant skills, first with my sister-in-law Lila's difficult delivery, then with Amelia's smoother one. The joy of bringing new life into the world had rekindled something inside her, a purpose she thought had died with Thomas. "I'll think about it," she replied, as she had before. But this time, she truly meant it. The homestead flourished under our shared efforts. The creek's gold provided financial security, and the babies, gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright's legacy in many ways, ensured that the name Winter would endure. Maybe it was time to widen my horizons beyond these lands that had been both my prison and my sanctuary for so long. Sensing my thoughts, my sister-in-law, Lila Montgomery, came out with her daughter in her arms. I followed, one hand resting on my expanding belly, as I eased myself onto a porch chair. "I heard a wagon," I said, nodding toward the sheriff. "Any news about Colonel Langston?" He repeated the update about the denied appeal, giving a satisfied nod. "Good," Sarah said firmly. "Let him rot." Abigail gently admonished her, though her voice lacked true conviction. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, the babies nestled in their mother's arms, peacefully dozing. Sheriff James Caldwell recounted town gossip, and Evelyn found herself observing everything around her with wonder. This family, born from fragments of the past, had become her future. The home that once echoed with memories of loss and grief now blossomed into a sanctuary of hope and promise. 5 years prior, she was prepared to end her life, convinced grief was all that remained. Now, as the evening painted the Nebraska sky in shades of pink and gold, Evelyn Harper looked upon her family and saw not an ending, but a beginning. Gunslinger Jedediah Cartwright had longed for roots, dreamed of children running free across these plains. In his absence, that dream had taken a new shape. Half-sisters I never knew, a half-brother who honored me, a wife who had found her way back into life, and 3 tiny lives, destined to grow up hearing tales of the brave Union lieutenant who, indirectly, had brought them all together. This wasn't the future I had envisioned, but it was better, richer, more intricate, filled with a love that grew not from obligation, but from choice, facing darkness side by side and emerging into the light. As stars began to shimmer in the darkening sky, Evelyn finally allowed herself to whisper the words that had been forming in her heart for months. This is enough. This is everything. And for the first time in years, she believed it.